So my talk is titled, "Is Technology Killing Privacy?" And hopefully we get a bit closer to the truth on that. When we think about privacy and technology have really been intertwined for a long time. So Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, who would end up becoming a Supreme Court justice, wrote a very influential law review article in 1890, which established the right to be let alone. And the technology that spurred them to think about privacy and privacy protection, the need for privacy protections, was the Kodak camera. First time that you could actually take snap photos of people as they walked past, rather than people having to pose for longer times to actually get a sharp picture. Similarly, in the 60s, Alan Weston started formulating what we now call information privacy, and this notion that privacy is about individuals controlling and managing and being able to delete information about themselves and deciding who has that information. And his thinking was spurred by the development of the mainframe computers. Right? So while when we talk about privacy today, we're often thinking social media and other such technologies. Really, technology has always been driving privacy, and privacy and technology have always been in some kind of tension. And if we look at privacy, there are all kinds of tensions that we see. On the one hand, we have government interests in terms of safety, law enforcement, national security. We have business interests. Companies are trying to mine data about individuals to better sell products to them. We also have just personal interests in sharing data, right? And we undermine our own privacy sometimes by because we want to socialize, because using the technology is convenient, because we want to present ourselves online in certain ways. And then technological advancement kind of keeps pushing and accelerating these tensions further and further. And when we think about privacy, a lot of people think about social media and how people kind of overshare on social media. But it's often not just what you post or share yourself. It's also about the traces you leave online or leave in general when you use technology. Right? And that starts with very basic and benign things like websites wanting to better understand where their visitors coming from. What are they doing on the website? Where maybe fall-off points where people fail to kind of complete the transaction and things like that. So lots of legitimate reasons why websites are tracking their visitors. However, one of the problems when it comes to privacy is that these analytics services are actually being provided by two companies primarily, namely Google and Facebook. This is a great study by Princeton researchers in 2016. They looked at the top 1 million websites, and they found that 75% of them had Google Analytics tracking code on them, and 25% had Facebook Analytics tracking code on them. And while it's convenient for website providers to use some of these services, the services that Google and Facebook offer here, it also means that Google and Facebook get a pretty comprehensive picture of where you're going when you're going from one website to the other, and so forth. But beyond that, when you're using the internet, when you go to the New York Times or somewhere else and you read an article, or you're browsing for a product you want to buy, you're not just often interacting with a direct website, but there are lots of trackers on this website that are monitoring you, often based on advertising and marketing partnerships that these companies have, right? So for news websites, you often find like a dozen or 24 different trackers that are keeping tabs on what articles are you reading, what might that say about who you are, or what you might be interested in. And the same is true when you use mobile apps. Many apps have tracking code embedded as an additional revenue source for the app providers. And that's not just the case for free apps. The studies by Berkeley colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, that have found that even paid apps often still have the same tracking code and are still tracking you in the same way. And this type of tracking, and consumer tracking, doesn't just occur in online or on your phone. It also occurs in stores. And so as you walk around and you go shopping, there might actually be Bluetooth beacons installed in the store that keep track of which aisles are you going down, what you're looking at. Many of you might have loyalty cards for the grocery stores you go to, right? Those are nice because they give you discounts, but also give the store permission to basically keep track of your shopping profiles and better understand who you are as a consumer and what you might like. And as we move towards smart homes and smart cities, this potential for data collection gets more and more. Okay, what happens here? The problem is that often, while we might think we are using technology, we actually end up being the product here, right? And for example, we see this, like this is an example of what it looks like when you actually want to buy ads, for example. This is Facebook's ads manager, where companies can go and say like, okay, I want to reach my target audience. And then you have all kinds of ways of tailoring who you want to reach with your advertisements. So you can tailor based on location, based on age, gender, but then there are also all kinds of detailed targeting options you can set. So I want to target households with who are in the top 10% of income, or I want to target people who are currently living away from family, or maybe closer to our heart, people who are Michigan fans. Right? And so all of this information that is being collected allows Facebook and other companies to create very detailed profiles of who you are, and then turn around and sell access to those profiles to marketers and companies. Beyond these direct interactions, there's also a whole economy of data brokers, which basically exist for the whole purpose of monetizing data they can get their hands on, and often, for example, sell data enrichment services. So if a company has, let's say, your phone number or your email address, but doesn't know anything else about you, they can go to a data broker and use a data enrichment service and say like, hey, what do you know about this email address? Or what do you know about this phone number? And that way get information about, possibly get your name, but more interesting to them, get your actual address, understand where you live, understand whether you may be in the market for a car right now, whether you are pregnant, all kinds of things that are being kept track of, and that then might make it easier to target advertising to you, or try to understand who you are. And Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism. So that these companies, while they create services and technologies that are seemingly consumer technologies, really exist to monetize data and do that at a large scale. Sorry, okay, here we go. One question we can ask is, well, what's the problem with that, right? Like we live in a capitalist society. You might say, I actually like it if I see advertisement that's relevant to me. What are the problems here? There are many, but it starts with something simple, such as unwanted disclosure. If your information is out there, companies, for example, can track your location. That information can also be sold and may be available to people you might not know or might not want to have access to that data. It can be used for surveillance by the government, for example, to surveil and arrest immigrants, or by police to monitor and try to identify protesters. It can also be exploited to exert political influence. So some of you might have heard about the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal a couple of years ago, where basically this marketing company, Cambridge Analytica, gained access to 50 million Facebook profiles and the connections, and then used this information in political campaigns to basically target political advertising and different types of political messages, depending on who you are. Data is also used for discrimination, and based on gender or age, people might see different ads and might be offered different prices. It also leads to racism. There are really interesting studies that show that if you type a black-sounding name into a search engine, you're much more likely to get offers for bail bonds and other services compared to a white-sounding name. And we also see that Some of these privacy harms particularly affect lower income people. Virginia Eubanks, in her book Automating Inequality, talks about how people who are reliant on government benefits, for example, and similar services, are made to reveal much more about their personal affairs and effects than other people, and are basically subject to kind of continuous scrutiny and monitoring. I think one of the really sometimes difficult to grasp privacy harms is the absence of opportunity. And you might never know that you didn't get this job interview because somehow a social media post from 10 years ago suggested that you might be a flaky employee, and other things, right? Like because how the data flows and how it's used often makes it very opaque when decisions are being made about you. And that's one of the key issues. And when we look at kind of like how do consumers think about this, in general, people are concerned about data used by companies and by governments. This data from a 2019 Pew Research Center survey that found that people are very concerned about the data used by companies, but at the same time, they also feel like they don't have control over how companies use the data. And so there's concern, but they don't know what to do about it. And sometimes this is called the privacy paradox in the literature. So this notion that people say they're concerned about privacy, but then they still use social media, they post on social media and buy smart speakers and other things. I like to think of it more as the fallacy of revealed preferences. So in economics, revealed preferences is this notion that we can best measure preferences, like true preferences, by looking at people's behaviors. And there's some value to that. But when it comes to privacy, it's unfortunately not quite as easy. And there's a great paper by my colleague, Alessandro Acquisti, and his collaborators that talks about the challenges and the problems with this notion of a privacy paradox. In my own research, we've been studying exposure-sensitive populations in particular. So these are populations that have heightened interest in protecting their privacy, and we try to understand, like, are they able to protect their privacy? And what we find is that that's often not the case. So we did research with undocumented immigrants and found that they use technologies the same way as all of us do. And they're aware of some of the risks, but really struggle to protect their privacy as they use technologies. More recently, we conducted a study with sex workers in Europe, where we found that while sex workers embrace technology for their work, they also use technology for personal reasons, but really struggle to keep kind of their work identity and their personal identity separate. Things like social media services, recommending clients as potential contacts, revealing clear names to clients, or revealing their work identity to their friends and family. In other work, we've been talking to older adults about their privacy and security needs and behaviors. And what we find is that concerns about privacy sometimes lead to a fear of adopting technology. So people are interested in using technology, but are worried about the potential privacy implications and security implications and don't do it because of that. While at the same time, we also see increased risk-taking because the way they think about risks might not be aligned with the actual risks that exist. And we find the same thing at the other end of the spectrum, looking at young children. So I'm working with child psychologists and pediatric researchers here at Michigan. We've been trying to understand how children think about data flows. And what we see is that they actually have a really good understanding of how recommendations work. Why am I seeing a certain video on YouTube, for example, or where do these Netflix recommendations come from? But what they struggle with is that many of their explanations are based on what they see right in front of them, visual cues in the interface. But often these, when it comes to data tracking and so forth, these things happen invisibly in the background. And these invisible practices are often not clear to children or difficult for them to understand. So lots of issues why people struggle to protect their privacy. And what it comes down to is that we as humans are just not very good at making consistent decisions, particularly when we face uncertainty both in terms of, well, what are actually the data practices that a company engages in, but also what are the risks associated with that. And then we need context to make decisions, and in technological context, we might sometimes be lacking the right information to understand what this context, what constitutes the context and how that works. And at the same time, there are lots of psychological tricks that can be exploited to get us to reveal more information than we might want to. And I'm going to talk about all of these a little bit more in detail. The first aspect is, when it comes to uncertainty, is that there are actually documents where you can learn about data practice of a company, privacy policies, right? And usually at this point, if we were in person, I would ask like, oh, how many of you have read privacy policies in the last month? And maybe one or two hands go up, maybe a few more, depending on what the audience is. But most people don't read privacy policies. And it really doesn't make sense to read them either. There's a really great paper by Alicia McDonald and Laurie Craner from 2008 that estimated that if you were to read all the privacy policies of the websites you visit, you would spend 244 hours per year just reading privacy policies. That's clearly not very realistic, right? And this is an estimate from 2008. We didn't have mobile apps yet. We didn't have smart speakers yet. We didn't have smart home technologies yet. I'm sure this number would be much, much higher today. In our own work, we looked at how the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, the European privacy law, how that going into effect in 2018 affected privacy protections for people online. And among many other things, we also looked at the length of privacy policies. And we found that after the GDPR went into effect, the average privacy policy was over 3,000 words long in Europe. And that's 42% longer than in 2016 when the GDPR was ratified, right? So they really increased in length. Now, I would actually argue that's a good thing. Privacy policies should be long, and they should probably be even longer. They should look more like SEC filings, where companies in detail need to describe their practices and what are they doing with the data of the customers. But we need to stop pretending that these are documents for consumers, right? Like, no one reads these privacy policies. And right now they don't actually serve the consumers well, and they don't serve regulators or oversight authorities well either, because they're way too vague to really understand what's going on. And to give you an example about these challenges in reading privacy policies, in 2019, it came out that Amazon, but also all the other smart speaker makers, had employees review voice commands to these speakers in order to improve speech recognition algorithms and kind of disambiguate between hard to understand words and things like that. And from a machine learning perspective, that absolutely makes sense, right? Like, if you ask someone who's trained in machine learning or artificial intelligence, well, what does it take to make these models better? Human annotation is one of the first ingredients to get good data sets. However, if you're lacking that background and you're looking at the Alexa FAQs at that time, the sentence, "We use your request to Alexa to train our speech recognition and natural language processing systems," going from that statement to someone might be listening to what I'm saying to my smart speaker at 2 a.m. in the morning in my bedroom is quite a leap, right? And even for technically trained people, like, you really need to think about this for a moment. Be like, oh yeah, okay, I guess that means that they might have people listening to what I'm saying to my smart speaker. So it's not just that these disclosures are too long, but also the information that's provided in the privacy policies is just not at a level that people can really understand what's going on. And all of this leads to what Nora Draper and Joe Turow call digital resignation. So people are concerned about their privacy, but they also want to enjoy the technology. So what they end up doing is they kind of close their eyes, cross their fingers, and hope for the best, and hope that, you know, ultimately the companies are looking out for their interests, which unfortunately is not really the case. In addition to that, privacy behavior can also be easily swayed, and we can, with simple tricks, people can be made to disclose much more information than they might want to. There's a great report by the Norwegian Consumer Bureau from 2018, Deceived by Design. And more recently, this whole field has kind of been associated with the term of dark patterns, basically design patterns in interfaces and interactions that are meant to kind of like trick people or sway people into doing things that might go against their actual interests. Together with colleagues at Ruhr University Bochum, we did a large-scale field experiment in 2019 where we wanted to better understand, well, can we actually, or to what extent can we affect people's consent rates? And so particularly in Europe, you see a lot of these cookie consent notices pop up on websites, but we're seeing them also more here in the US, that basically, like this one is already a pretty detailed notice. It actually tells you what's going on. And then you get to accept or decline. And then you say, I'm okay with the cookie consent notice. So we looked at different types of notices, but we were also interested, well, can something simple like where on the screen do we show the notice? Does it have an effect on how people interact with these notices? And lo and behold, it does. What we find is that when we show these notices in the bottom left corner, or on the top left, or just at the bottom of the screen, people are much more likely to interact with these notices, but also click accept more likely, right? It's exactly the same notice in all of these conditions, but just the position results in different rates of acceptance or consent. And there are additional tricks we can use to even increase this further. So there's this concept of enhanced choice, right? Like we highlight what is the option we want people to select and click, and that kind of serves as an implicit recommendation to people. So if we use this in this, we found if we use this in the context of our study, by just highlighting the accept button, we get significantly higher rates of people clicking on accept compared to having equally balanced highlights. And interestingly, this effect even persists for merely informational notices, right? So this is the same notice. There's no other option except an accept button or to ignore the notice. If we highlight the accept button, more people click the accept button. And that really draws into the question, this whole notion of freely given consent or informed consent, right? If just like these minor details of how you present the consent dialogue changes people's reaction to it. In other research, we looked at smart speakers and the privacy controls that come with them. And what we find is that many of those are not really aligned with users' needs, right? So for example, these speakers have a button at the top to mute the speaker. And what we found is that many of our participants actually thought it would not turn off the microphone, which is the function, but instead turn off the volume of the speaker. So they wouldn't use it because they didn't think it would actually serve their purpose. Or another aspect is that you can often go into either a mobile app or the website and then see previous commands that were given to the smart speaker, and then also go there and delete maybe a sensitive command or something you don't want the company to have. But when we talked with our participants about this, they didn't really think about those tools as privacy features. And to the contrary, we even had some participants who talked about how they might use that functionality to check up on what their babysitter or house sitter had been up to while they were away, or store recordings of what the children had been saying to the smart speaker because it sounded particularly cute. And I can relate to this. I have 2 little kids, but other research shows that when children learn that what they say to these kinds of technologies or to smart toys is being recorded, they're very creeped out by that and find that very concerning. In other work, we looked at, can people actually find privacy controls? And what you see here is in gray, kind of how many clicks does it take to get to a certain type of control. And then in blue, you see the average number of clicks it took people to find them. And what you can see is it just takes a lot of searching to find privacy controls, even if you're looking for them. So it's, and one of the reasons is that they're not in standard locations. So people are searching all over the place. So is technology killing privacy? What we've talked about so far doesn't look too promising, right? But there's some hope. First, we're actually hearing much more about privacy issues, and they've really come into the spotlight, I'd say, in the last 5 years. And we're also seeing much more regulation focused on privacy. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation was the most heaviest lobbied piece of legislation in the history of the European Union. And it still ended up being a very pro-consumer law that actually increased and improved privacy protections for Europeans, but because of its extraterritorial applicability, also around the world. In the US, we saw California adopt the first comprehensive privacy law in 2018 and just went into effect last year. And as part of the last election in 2020, Californians adopted a proposition called the California Privacy Rights Act that further increases privacy protections in California. Brazil and other companies have been adopting comprehensive privacy laws. And I love this map. I always show it in my class. And what we see is that in almost all, or not almost all, many of the US states, there's also state laws being considered for privacy protection. And just in 2021, we already had Virginia and Colorado adopt new comprehensive privacy legislation, which now means we have, with Virginia, Colorado, and California, we have 3 states with comprehensive privacy laws in the US. And maybe I should explain what that means. It means a comprehensive privacy law is not just constrained to a specific context, such as HIPAA for healthcare on the federal level or FERPA for education data, but instead just applies to the processing of personal identifiable information, regardless of what the context or the domain is in which that data is being processed. And on the federal level, there's also lots of talks. There has been lots of talks for federal data privacy legislation for a while. And just yesterday, Senator Roger Wicker introduced a privacy bill. And I'm not holding my breath that we're getting anywhere with a federal privacy law anytime soon. I'm happy to talk more about why not. I don't think that, but at least there's definitely movement. It's something that politicians care about and also tech companies care about, interestingly, because many of the US companies are already complying with the general data protection regulation in Europe. And the biggest nightmare for the companies is now that they will have 50 different state laws that all require slightly different things and are potentially incompatible with the European law. So there's lots of interest from companies as well to get to a federal privacy law. And we also see increased oversight activities with Congress being much more interested in what the tech companies are doing, and also more enforcement, both from the Federal Trade Commission here. Sorry that Facebook keeps popping up as the example here, but I guess that's on them, not on me. When the Federal Trade Commission imposed a $5 billion penalty on Facebook, it was in 2019, that was the largest penalty the US government has ever levied against a private company. Yet, if you think about it, $5 billion, well, a lot of money in general. For Facebook, it's kind of a slap on the wrist given their $55 billion revenue in the same year. However, what's kind of interesting about these settlements that the Federal Trade Commission puts into place is that it's not just a financial penalty, but also comes with 20-year auditing and compliance obligations for Facebook, as well as changes to the internal reporting structure of Facebook to better hold the company and its CEO accountable for privacy missteps. And in Europe, the GDPR went into effect in 2018, and in recent years, we've kind of seen data protection authorities kind of slowly warming up to larger fines and going after bigger companies. And I think in the next couple of years, we can expect much larger fines here. Now, so when Lewis introduced me, he talked about how we're interested in understanding people's privacy behaviors. The other part of our research focuses on, well, how can we actually make it easier for people to control their privacy? And for companies, there's lots of, beyond these legal requirements, they might also just care and want to do the right thing to their consumers. So a lot of our work has kind of looked at, well, what can we actually do here? And the 3 important things that help people make better decisions when it comes to privacy and make it easier for people to manage their privacy. One is the information we give to people has to be relevant to what they're currently doing, right? When you go to a news website, you might want to know, well, are you tracking what I'm reading? who is that data being shared with, who else has access to that. Finding that information in the privacy policy is actually very, very difficult because there are all kinds of other things in the privacy policy. Basically, any potential interaction you might ever have with a company is going to be listed in the privacy policy. So it becomes really difficult to really understand what's happening in a particular moment. What we've shown in our work is that actually one way forward is to focus on unexpected or surprising practices. So in this particular study, we looked at fitness trackers, and we showed our participants a fitness tracker. This is a Fitbit watch, and then gave them a list of data practices. Some were real, some were fake, and asked them, do you think this product engages in this practice? And by doing this, we found, like, for some practices, such as the collection of step data, almost every one of our participants expected that that's the case. That's why you would buy a fitness tracker, right? Like, you want to count your steps. However, then for other aspects, like the collection of location data, only 31% of participants expected this, likely because this data collection doesn't actually happen on the watch. It happens in the mobile app, the mobile companion app that comes with a watch and lives on the phone. Right now, if we're thinking about, well, what are the things we need to most urgently inform people about? The location collection is probably the practice we might want to highlight, or potentially also ask for opt-in consent instead of just collecting the data by default. It's also important that information is understandable. Right? Like, I keep harping on privacy policies and how they're difficult to understand or too long, but they don't have to be. So the Cram-Leach-Pliley Act, for example, which regulates the financial industry, requires that companies provide concise privacy notices that follow this 2-page format you see right here. And while there are issues with this format, for sure, it's very concise, it's down to the point, and it makes choices and makes information and choices available to consumers in a consistent way. We see kind of similar efforts lately. For example, Apple introduced privacy labels in its App Store that tell you what data is linked to your identity by an app and what data is, and if any, is being used to track you. However, this type of information is only useful if it's also actionable in some kind of way, right? Like, people need to be able to do something with that information. If the only choice is, I don't use a certain technology, I don't use Facebook, I don't use that fitness tracker, then privacy usually loses out because there are other interests at play. Right? But an example of real choices are these mobile permission dialogues that are now common both for iOS and Android, that don't just ask for consent, they actually let you make your choice, right? Can this app have access to your contacts, to your photos or other things? And you can say no, and people say no. And that has actually led to app makers thinking more about how they can explain why they want access to a certain resource, and turn this more into a dialogue rather than just assuming that people have read the privacy policy and agree with everything that's in there. And then controls need to be usable in order to be useful. So when we did our smart speaker study, one of the things we found is that one of the problems of the privacy controls that exists with smart speakers is that people often have to go to the device and press a button on the device, or they have to do something in their mobile app. Whereas the normal way how you interact with a smart speaker is you talk to the smart speaker. So voice is the primary mode of interaction. And our recommendation was that that should also be the case for privacy controls. And 2 years ago, Amazon started introducing voice commands for privacy. Like, you can now say, Alexa, delete everything I said today. And then it removes what your previous voice commands automatically. We're thinking a lot about how we can better integrate privacy information and controls directly into user experiences, rather than having them hidden away in the privacy policy or overwhelming people with like lots of text or choices when they don't make sense. And we kind of think along 4 dimensions when we think about the design of privacy interfaces. It's, when do you show it to users? What's the channel? Can you actually show it on the same device? Usually that's the case for like a phone or a computer, but maybe not so useful for a smart thermostat, right? Like, you don't want to read a privacy notice on your thermostat. So in those cases, we might need secondary channels like sending an email or leveraging a mobile app that might exist on a phone. And then how can we really engage people with this information in a meaningful way? what modalities, and how can we integrate controls into this to ensure usability. We've been working a lot on beyond kind of like trying to establish these best practices and guidelines and communicating those to industry. We're also thinking about, well, how can we help consumers in the moment? We've worked a lot on privacy nudges. So the idea here is that we make people aware of potential privacy invasive behavior and then help them better manage their settings. In this particular study, we showed people this message: did you know your location has been shared 5,398 times with certain apps? And then we let them change their settings. And what we found is, even if we show this message randomly throughout the day to people while they're going about their normal days, this large number, which is a real number from one of our study participants here, sufficiently spooks people that they actually switch away from their primary activity and start exploring their privacy settings. So by reducing the threshold for engaging with privacy settings and making otherwise invisible information say and invisible, we can get people's attention and can get them to think about and reflect on their privacy settings. We can go even a bit further and analyze the app code to figure out, well, what might the application be using this information for? So for example, for targeted advertising or consumer tracking. In other work, we analyzed privacy policies using deep learning techniques and natural language processing techniques to build a chatbot. So Prybot, you can go to prybot.org and try this out. You can ask questions about a company, and then the system answers based on information from the privacy policy for that company. And sometimes it can give directly short answers, or it gives excerpts from the privacy policy. Similar work, we looked at links in privacy policies to try to identify potential privacy controls and opt-out links. And we extracted them from the privacy policy and built a browser extension that you can install called Opt-out Easy. And then when you go to a website, it shows you all the available opt-outs in a easily accessible interface without having to look for them in the privacy policy. We're also thinking about how we can make privacy protections better part of design from the get-go. Right? So instead of smart speakers having a microphone that's always on, can we maybe use interpersonal communication cues to determine when the microphone should be active? So we built prototypes that only turn on the microphone when you actually look at the smart speaker. Or in the bottom, we used voice volume to determine when speech recognition should be activated. So you can still talk quietly with your family or your friends. And then if you want to talk with Alexa, you speak a little louder and it activates the speech recognition. And while we can do lots of interesting things in that regard, all of this only makes sense if the technologies are also available by default. Right? I mentioned earlier that Amazon introduced voice commands for privacy. The problem is they're off by default. You have to go deep into the settings and activate them. And most people never change the defaults for these types of settings, right? So they're not really that useful yet for people. And the way I like to talk with companies in particular about privacy interfaces, to really think of them not as compliance exercises, but as opportunities, both to explain why they are engaging in certain data practices, what protections are they putting in place, and by doing that, reduce consumer surprise and build trust and actually create engage more in a dialogue about what's acceptable and isn't acceptable when it comes to privacy. And then what's important though with all of this is to actually go out and do research with users and test systems with users. And I'm just going to go very quickly through an anecdote here. So we've been working with the Office of the Attorney General in California on the Do Not Sell My Personal Information opt-out. The law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, said there should be an icon or a button associated with it that companies can use to kind of identify this opt-out. We approached them with a larger team and said to the Office of the Attorney General, hey, we actually have experience in this area. Can we work with you to design this icon to make sure it's not misleading to consumers? They were like, sure, we have an open comment period. Why don't you submit it as a report? Right, so we did that. We went through like a round of multiple rounds of designs and user studies, and our recommendation was the icon you see here. And we found that when consumers see this icon, they understand that there are choices associated that they can do something, can make choices, and that these link texts do not sell my personal information or privacy options are not too confusing. So we handed our support to the Office of the Attorney General. They said, thank you. And then a couple of weeks later, they came out with their own recommendation in draft regulations with this icon you see here. And it looks kind of similar to our icon, but we weren't sure that it was not, because it was similar, we weren't sure whether it actually worked the same way. And us and other people on the internet were also concerned that it maybe looked a little bit too close to an actual toggle button. So we ran another study, and what we found is that indeed, when people saw this red icon down here, they thought it was a direct control button. So it's not an icon to say like, oh, click here to do something, but if they would click this button, it would actually change the setting directly. And because it's red, people thought they had already opted out of personal information. So while these are only minor changes to the interface, right? Like these icons look somewhat similar. These minor changes actually led in the icon being interpreted as meaning the opposite of what it was supposed to communicate. As a result of that, the OHG decided to just get rid of the icon in the regulations. But then we were happy to learn that in March, they actually ended up adopting our recommended icon, and it's now part of the California law and the regulations for the CCPA. So with that, I'm at the end, and I started with this question: is technology killing privacy? I would say only if we let it, right? Like there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we can do both in terms of how we design technology as well as what public policy requires from companies to make sure privacy and technology can coexist together. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.